everybody. We're so glad that you're able to join all of us tonight as we go over Clinical Trials 101, Understanding the Basics. We're very happy to have you all here. I'm going to pass it over to my friend Ryan to talk a little bit about why we're providing you with this webinar.
Thank you, Amanda. So thrilled to be here amongst my colleagues to talk about clinical trials. And why we're doing this webinar is this community is heading into late stage trials, phase 3 trials, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And we want to arm you with information as you make choices with physicians about whether or not to participate. And why clinical trials are so important? Well, clinical trials are important because they help researchers develop new ways to prevent, detect, and treat diseases and improve quality of life for people diagnosed with certain illnesses. They really are the fundamental part of clinical research and are at the core of medical advances. Now I'm going to hand it over to Amanda to introduce our amazing speakers.
Well, we're very excited. We have a great group of people who are here with us tonight to talk about clinical trials. First, you just heard from Ryan Fischer, who is the Chief Operating Officer of FAST. We also have Niki Armstrong, who is the VP of Genetic Services and Education for FAST, and Katie Garbarini, who's our Director of the Ladder Learning Network. So we're just going to jump right in because we want to make sure that we can cover the topics as you can see here. We're going to talk about the definitions and phases, talk a little bit about eligibility and enrollment, participation in the caregiver experience. We're going to talk about informed consent and your rights as a participant, data results, and the resource sharing that we can provide for you. So let's jump into the very first question here. And this question is going to be for Katie. So Katie, can you tell us a little bit about what is a clinical trial?
Sure. So a clinical trial is a research study. So it's essentially an experiment where a person is receiving an intervention or a drug to evaluate the effects of that intervention or drug on a health-related outcome.
So as it relates to people who are listening, who are people who have a loved one with Angelman syndrome, why are clinical trials important for Angelman syndrome?
Sure. So clinical trials are absolutely necessary to develop new therapies. They're required by regulatory bodies like the Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency, or the EMA. It's a rigorous way to prove that a new drug has benefits and has acceptable side effects and/or risks.
So Niki, one of the questions that Ryan and I get quite often is understanding the different phases of a study. It can be very confusing for the community when when we talk about the different phases, when we combine phases. So I'd be curious, can you kind of talk to us about what the different phases of a clinical trial are?
Sure, I get this question a lot too. So there are 4 phases of clinical trials, starting with phase 1. The purpose of a phase 1 clinical trial is to study whether a new treatment for the first time ever in humans is safe and to identify any potential side effects, which people will also call adverse events. Oftentimes, a phase 1 study will use different dose levels of a drug to try to learn about the different safety of those dose levels. And phase 1 trials often only use a small number of participants. And sometimes they actually do phase 1 trials in healthy volunteers rather than in individuals living with the disorder. Now, if phase 1 trials go well, the next step is a phase 2 clinical trial. The purpose of a phase 2 clinical trial is to start testing whether a new drug is safe and shows benefit, which that means it has an impact on symptoms of the particular condition in a population that actually has that condition. And then they keep monitoring for side effects, they keep monitoring for tolerability. And usually a phase 2 trial will have a larger number of participants than a phase 1 trial. They then take all those results from phase 1 and phase 2 trials and use those to design the larger phase 3 trial. The phase 3 trial is usually considered kind of the most important. It's also called a confirmatory trial or a pivotal study. And really, the goal of a phase 3 trial is to confirm all the results from the earlier studies and then definitively show that a new drug is safe and that it provides benefit on those important symptoms of the disorder. For example, in Angelman syndrome, important symptoms that could be impacted by a treatment might include improvements in communication, improvements in motor skills, fewer seizures, better sleep, improved behaviors. Phase 3 studies might involve hundreds of individuals living with the condition, and they often include 2 groups of participants. So sometimes they'll call them arms, 2 arms or 2 groups of participants. One group will receive the study drug, and then one group does not receive the study drug. The group who does not receive the study drug might get a placebo or a fake drug instead, or they might have a sham or a fake procedure. And then usually these two groups are blinded. So that means that the family and the people conducting the assessments do not know who is receiving the study drug. That's done on purpose. And really the goal there is try to limit any bias and make sure that if any benefits are noticed, those benefits are actually a result of the study drug. So all of those phase 1, 2, and 3 trials happen, and then that information is submitted to the regulatory bodies. So that's people like the Food and Drug Administration or the FDA or the EMA. After a drug is approved by the FDA, it then can go into phase 4 clinical trials. So that happens, after it's been approved by the FDA and it's available to individuals that are living with the condition. And those phase 4 clinical trials really are meant to try to study any side effects that might happen over a really long time, because clinical trials usually have a very set period, so they might not have data that goes more than 5 or 10 years. So this phase 4 trials might follow for longer than that. And they might include a really large group of people, like thousands of people. And participation might only be participating in a registry rather than going in for doctor visits. This phase 4 clinical trials are often sometimes called post-market surveillance.
I'm curious, in rare conditions like AS, it's common for phase 1 and 2 trials to be combined, correct?
That is correct. It's really common for phase 1 and phase 2 trials to be combined, because phase 1 trials sometimes are only in healthy volunteers, and a lot of the potential therapies for rare diseases, it's not really applicable to try them in a healthy volunteer, so they combine the phase 1 and the phase 2 trials.
So Katie, I think one thing that is really important for us to understand in the community is around safety. So how is patient safety ensured during clinical trials?
Sure, happy to talk about this a little bit. So before a clinical trial can even get started, there has to be data showing the potential for benefit and safety in animals before that all has to be submitted to the FDA before we can even think about, human studies. So the FDA reviews that data before they give permission for a clinical trial to start. And then once the trial is actually underway, there are multiple layers of protection. So there's the physician who's in charge of the site. That's the principal investigator. They're just one layer of protection. And what they do is at every visit, the PI or the staff ask the individual who's in the trial or their family members, how are they doing? What's going on? Has anything changed? So they keep a really close eye on that person's status. And then sometimes there's also a separate group of experts. This would be another layer of protection called the Data Safety Monitoring Board, who would review study data ongoing, throughout the trial to help ensure safety.
That's great. Thanks, Katie. And it's so important because even in the early phase studies, all that information on safety, families are made aware of that prior to getting into or going into rather later stage trials. So Niki, let's talk about getting into these trials and around eligibility and enrollment, because we have lots of interest in families who may want to participate in a clinical trial. But as we know, there's specific what's called inclusion and exclusion criteria related to clinical trials. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the inclusion and exclusion criteria are really just the rules for participating in the clinical trial. They're typically set before the trial starts, and they're agreed upon with the FDA. And in order to participate, an individual must meet all of the inclusion criteria and must not have any of the exclusion criteria. For example, a trial in Angelman syndrome might have inclusion criteria that include ages 4 to 21 years and a genotype of deletion, and an exclusion criteria might be uncontrolled seizures. But each trial has its own set of these inclusion and exclusion criteria.
That's really helpful. And I think it's important to note that, companies make decisions based on what they believe may be the fastest possible route to getting the answers they need for an approval. So you may see nuance with why they're choosing a specific inclusion-exclusion criteria. But Katie, how are these participants even selected for a clinical trial? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely something that we hear, sort of all the time, both at ASF and FAST. So there certainly can be some variability in how this is approached. But across all sites, the first question is, does this participant meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria? And in some places or some cases, there may be additional rules in place about travel to the site or distance from the site. So that would also be taken into consideration. And so far, there's been a lot of interest in the ASO clinical trials, but the clinical trials themselves have been pretty small. So many of the families who wanted to participate have not yet been able to participate. So some of the sites are keeping a wait list of families who have indicated that they're interested in participating. And that site may start with that list when future trials are ready to enroll. But the ultimate decision about whether or not an individual can participate in a clinical trial is made by the principal investigator or the PI at the clinical trial site. So we're just going to play a quick game of myth or fact. So as the director of the ASF's clinical network, I often hear questions related to the ASF's clinics program and active clinical trials. So we're going to play a game to explore some of these common questions. All right, Amanda, let's hear the first quote here.
Okay. So my child sees an ASF clinic neurologist who is leading a clinical trial in Angelman syndrome. Scheduling a follow-up visit with my neurologist will increase the chances that my child is enrolled in a clinical trial. Katie, is this a myth or a fact?
So this one is a myth. Yeah. Okay. Good timing, Amanda. Pulling that myth up. This is something I unfortunately have heard just sort of rumors about, where people think that if they make an appointment in the clinic, if they get some more face time with the neurologist, that's going to bump them up the wait list. But scheduling a follow-up clinic visit is not going to increase the chances that you're able to enroll in the trial. Doctors leading the trial have to follow a standardized system. So just trying to get some more face time is not going to bump you all up the list. All right, let's hear that next quote here, Niki.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Niki. It's okay. You're fine.
Sorry. Okay. I have questions about a new symptom in my child living with AS, and I'm also interested in learning more about the clinical trial. I should make an appointment to discuss the new symptom and to learn more about the clinical trial.
Okay, so this one is a fact. So if you have a new symptom in your kiddo, you should absolutely have a healthcare provider evaluate that symptom. And then if you also have questions about a trial, ASF clinics are a great place to learn more. All right, let's go to our last quote here. Ryan, what's our last quote?
Our last quote is, I have to be seen in an ASF clinic to be eligible to enroll in a clinical trial. Myth or fact?
So this one is a sometimes. It's a trick question. It's not a myth or a fact. So for some clinical trial sites, you don't have to be seen as a patient in the clinic before enrolling in the clinical trials. But for some locations or some clinics, there actually is a requirement for you to be seen and routinely followed in the clinic. And that precedent is not set by the ASF. It's not set by FAST. It's typically set by the hospital system for safety reasons. And really what they're trying to avoid is having two different providers managing the same kiddo, prescribing medicines differently. Like, we need to have things as consistent and as transparent as we can in a trial so that we don't obscure the results of the trial. But yeah, so that I would say, like, if you're interested, really the best thing to do is to contact the location that's closest to you, or really, I mean, the ones that you can get to reasonably or that make sense for your family, and ask them, like, what are your protocols? Do we need to be a patient in the trial, or do we need to be a patient at the clinic first?
So it's all, Katie, it's all going to come back to any one of us directing the family to the clinics themselves. So this is an important underline that ASF and FAST and even the companies do not have a way to put somebody within a trial themselves, push somebody in front of some line or anything like that, correct?
Correct. It's all run, I mean, it's really the PI's domain, really. That's how they're running the trial at their site, with the protections that their hospital has in place for how to run clinical trials safely.
Well, and if I can just add too, not all clinical trials are happening in an ASF clinic. So it's just really important for you to stay on top of the whole the whole clinical trial altogether and where the locations are, which we'll dive deeper in later. But I think it's important for all of us to keep stressing that this is not a decision that is made by ASF or FAST, or most of the time the actual clinics themselves. There are rules and mandates that they are following themselves. So to add on to that, Katie, the question always comes up, how to find out how we can enroll into a clinical trial. What is the best thing to do?
Sure. So there are multiple mechanisms to find trials. One option is talking directly with your Angelman syndrome care team. You can also regularly do searches on clinicaltrials.gov. You can subscribe to the ASF and FAST newsletters and email communication, social media. Any big news related to a clinical trial is going to be readily available through both the ASF and FAST. So that's really a good place to start. And then once there is a trial that's available that you're interested in, and that trial's posted on clinicaltrials.gov, there'll be contact information there, either for the company sponsoring the trial or the trial site. Either way, once you're interested in enrolling, you can reach out to that provided contact, whether that's the company or whether that's the clinical trial site itself.
Okay, thank you.
Really helpful. Let's pivot, talk a bit more about now the actual participant and caregiver family experience. Niki, first and foremost, how do they get detailed information about being in a particular trial? Let's go there first.
Sure. So a good first place to look is the website clinicaltrials.gov. And it has a lot of information just in general about the particular trial. In addition, some clinical trials are going to have a website that's dedicated just to that trial. And so there might be additional details there. There also might be webinars or other presentations at conferences like ASF or FAST that will tell you about a particular clinical trial. Now, a really detailed resource is the consent form. The consent form typically outlines everything that's done during the trial, as well as the potential risks and benefits. But typically, the consent form isn't available until you've been in contact with a particular clinical trial site and are a little bit further down the line in the process.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, and let's talk a bit about that process. So what can families expect during a clinical trial about the experience?
Sure. It's a little bit of a tough question to answer just because each clinical trial is so different. But one thing that they all have in common is that they all follow a plan known as a protocol. The protocol outlines everything that happens in the clinical trial. It outlines when a study drug is given, what testing is done, when that testing is done, pretty much everything. And typically, once you're seriously considering participating in a trial, you get that copy of the consent form to review, and that consent form includes the summary of the protocol. After that, after you have some time to review that consent form, you would have a visit scheduled to review the consent with staff that are at the clinical trial site. And you can then ask your questions and potentially complete the screening visit. That screening visit is really, it's a way to check to make sure that the person who's considering participating in the trial is healthy and that participating will be as safe as possible for that individual. So it includes testing and an exam and all those sorts of things. If the screening visit is successful, then the participant can actually start the trial-related procedures, which again can vary greatly depending on what the clinical trial is for. Some clinical trials might have monthly visits to a hospital and lumbar punctures. Others might have an oral medication and weekly virtual visits. Some trials are going to require an individual to stay in the hospital. It just can be really variable. But during the trial, there will always be set procedures. There will always be a very exact timeline to follow, and those will always be outlined within the protocol. I think it's always really important to keep in mind that participating in a clinical trial can be stressful and intense. Before participating, you really want to think about how participating could affect you and your loved one and the rest of your family.
Great. Thank you for that information. And just doubling back on something you mentioned, the screening process. So patients can screen fail necessarily in the beginning of the process. In other words, they may be screened out. Is that correct?
That is correct. So if something is identified during the screening visit, like maybe there are laboratory values that show that the kidneys or liver aren't functioning very well, or something like that comes up during the screening process, then that person wouldn't be able to go any further during the clinical trial for their own safety and health.
That's the real reason for the screening process. Okay, so say they're getting into the trial, what are the potential risks and benefits of participating in a clinical trial? And I know this can vary as well.
Yeah, this again is going to be hard to predict since each clinical trial is so different. The exact risks are going to depend on the study drug and all the procedures that happen during the trial. The consent form is going to contain a review of all that. So all the known or expected risks or benefits should be summarized in the consent form. That being said, it's also possible that there are unknown risks or benefits. Remember, clinical trials are like experiments, so there are things we might not know yet. And early phase clinical trials, so like those phase 1, 2, or the first in humans, they're going to probably have more unknowns than the later phase clinical trials. But as the trial goes, if there are any new risks or benefits that are identified, it's the clinical trials team's job to let you know of any new information that becomes available. Now, during this whole process, you play a really important role in keeping your loved ones safe while participating in a clinical trial. If you notice any changes in your loved one's health, if there are new medications, changes in medications, new procedures, illnesses, hospitalizations, even if it seems completely unrelated, all of that should be reported back to the study team.
So important, really important for every study. So say my loved one's in a clinical trial, can I share with others that I'm participating? Many of our families, our supporters have been following our stories and really, they want to know exactly what's going on. Can you talk a little bit about what's okay to share and what we know about sharing of information?
Or it's a really good question. If by share you mean social media, the answer is no. Sharing on social media can actually harm a trial, especially if it's a placebo-controlled or sham-controlled trial. If by share you mean talk to your mom or your best friend or most trusted healthcare provider, any of those sort of individuals, especially while you're trying to decide whether or not to participate in a trial, that's totally fine. Also, while you're in a trial, your loved one's care team should be made aware that he or she is participating in the trial.
It's really, really important information, and is really important for the integrity of these studies. So what are the things to consider if I learn about a clinical trial? What questions should I ask? Should I go to my clinic with?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two levels of questions that I think about. One are questions that you ask yourself. Things like, what's my tolerance for risk? Every clinical trial is going to have potential risks. How do I feel about that? And then also questions about what you can handle in your life. Can you participate in the trial locally? Would you have to travel? If you have to travel, can you take time off work? Do you have childcare for your other kids? How do you balance that in addition to everything else that's happening in your life? So I think that's kind of the first tier of questions. The next tier of questions are questions that you want to ask at the site, like at your consenting visit or early kind of along in the process. And actually, the National Institutes of Health helps with that. They have a list of questions that they're like, hey, these are good questions to think about as you're going into a clinical trial. And it includes things like, what do we know about the risks and the benefits of this study drug? What are the required procedures? Is it possible that my loved one will not receive study drug? How long would my loved one be in this study? What happens when the study ends? Is there potential for access to the study drug through another study? Does participating in this study mean that you can't participate in future clinical trials? So that's a good set of questions to start with.
That's great. I'm going to hand it to Amanda to talk a little bit about informed consent with Katie now, but it's important just to remind everyone that you have every right to ask as many questions as possible with your healthcare providers when it comes to joining these trials. Remember that you have those rights. Amanda?
Yeah, and I think that leads right into the informed consent because you have every right to read it, ask about it, ask many questions over and over again. We've used the word informed consent and we've talked a little bit about participation rights, but we want to dive a little bit more into the informed consent because sometimes it can be something that's 70, 80, 90 pages long and really overwhelming for families. So Katie, tell me a little bit, how is informed consent obtained and what does it usually entail?
Sure. So informed consent is really a process, and it's a process in which people are accurately informed of the purpose, methods, risks, benefits, and alternatives to research, and then are helped to understand this information and then how it relates to their own clinical situation or interest. And then individuals make a voluntary decision about whether or not to participate. And typically informed consent is obtained by reviewing the consent form with the parents and guardians of the loved one who's entering the study. So it's often performed by a study doctor and study coordinator. During that study consent, it is really a good time to get your questions answered if they haven't already been answered. And depending on the trial and the procedures involved, reviewing that consent form can take 1 to 2 hours. So it can take quite a bit of time to go through. And it's really the study coordinator and study doctor's job to really help show you what are the most important things you need to know about the study and to really help you understand so that you feel empowered to make a decision to participate in the study or not. Informed consent should also continue throughout the study. You should be updated if the protocol changes or there's new information available about risks or benefits. And it really should just be sort of an ongoing process where you've got that consent form to reference, but you've also got your study team available should additional questions or concerns come up over time.
And I think it's important, I mean, because I know as parents, we get really exhausted and spending 1 to 2 hours or spending a lot of time reviewing that can be very overwhelming. But it is really, really important to make sure you understand what your role is, what their role is, what questions you may have through that process. So Niki, I'm curious from your perspective, what are participants' rights during clinical trials?
Sure. So again, the National Institutes of Health helps with this. They come up with a whole list of participant rights for clinical trials. First, there's the right to privacy and keeping your private information confidential. So this is like all medical records. We have the right to keep all that information private. Second is anyone who participates in a clinical trial has the right to change their mind. They can decide that they don't want to be in the trial anymore, it doesn't match their interests, and then they can withdraw from that trial without a penalty. And that without a penalty means that they can keep getting their regular clinical care. It doesn't affect their ability to still see their regular doctors. Participants also have the right to be informed if there's any new information. So again, that might be things like new risks that are identified or that, an adjustment of how much risk might be associated with a study drug. So anything that might change their assessment of the risks and the benefits should be told to the participant while they're in the trial. They also have the right to have their welfare monitored. So if they have any side effects or unexpected things happen during the trial, or they change how healthy they are during the trial, they have the right to appropriate treatment, and if it's necessary for their health, to be removed from the study. And then finally, when the study is all done, participants should have the right to be informed about what was learned from the research. So does this particular study drug have any benefits? If so, participants have the right to learn that information.
Thank you. I think that's so important because I think that even if you question or wonder if this is a right of mine or this seems a little off, as a participant, you should always speak up and figure out, and share your concerns because they're valid and you're participating in something that is so needed, but there's a lot that goes into it. So if there's any time that something feels wrong or off, you definitely have the right to look into that. So thank you for sharing that. I think we're going to pivot a little bit. You talked at the end about, inform, part of it is learning about the data and, the results and what those rights are. So Niki, I'm curious, how do the results of clinical trial data collected usually, how does it contribute to the development of new treatments?
Sure. So all the data from clinical trials is reviewed by the sponsor of the trial. So that's usually the company that makes the drug, and sometimes by an independent monitoring board. And if that data is positive, if the study drug shows a benefit on one of the outcomes, one of the symptoms of the drug and the symptoms of the condition, and there are low or acceptable risks with that study drug, then hopefully that study drug will keep moving through the clinical trial phases. So, if phase 1/2 trial shows positive, then that data would be used to help design the phase 3 trial. Now, if you get to the phase 3 clinical trial, that pivotal clinical trial, and the data again is positive, again, the individuals who get the study drug show some improvement in the outcomes and there's low or acceptable risks, then usually the next step is to submit all that data to the regulatory bodies like the FDA and the EMA. The FDA and the EMA would then review the provided data and they decide whether to approve the drug and how the drug should be labeled. And that the label is it's kind of some more specific information about who the drug should be available to. So that might include certain ages or certain genotypes. It might include if there are contradictions, like if there are contraindications, if there are certain people who would be at a higher risk if there were serious safety complications if they used that particular drug. And then once the drug is FDA approved, drugs can be prescribed by healthcare providers and often paid for by insurance. And then, of course, the goal is always that more people would have access to those drugs.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Amanda, I think we've seen, when it comes to data being released in the earlier phases of studies, you may see companies have different styles with how much information they're putting out from the earlier phases. So I think it's a choice by the company about the level of information they're putting out, but it's important to remember those early phase studies are not the larger controlled studies. They're often open label. The patients know, their families know they're on drug, but these are just sort of almost stylistic differences that companies may have in how they present or talk about the early data. Something I thought important for us to point out.
Oh, 100%. I think that's a great point, because I think there's a lot of frustration sometimes within the community about how data is being shared or when. So I think it's important to note that that is up to the industry and to their discretion. So Ryan, I'm going to pass it on to you to talk about the last slide here and wrap up our awesome time together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So let's now talk about resources. So Katie, what resources are available for families that are interested in clinical trials?
Yeah, so there are a lot of resources available, and I would say a few good ones to learn about clinical trial participation in general would be the NIH website, clinicaltrials.gov, and then the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, the ASF, and FAST both have website sections that are just dedicated to clinical trials. There's also a shared resource between the ASF, FAST, and the Angelman Syndrome Alliance, or ASA, and that's angelmanclinicaltrials.com. And that's also a really good Angelman specific resource. And then as we, think more about like an individual site or an individual clinical trial, some clinical trials are going to have their own websites. Another good resource is going to be healthcare providers, especially the PIs of the study. The consent form is a good resource over time. And then each site will also have local resources that are for families who are participating in the clinical trial.
That's great. Wonderful. So I just want to thank our wonderful speakers, Katie and Niki, and to my partner, Amanda, in this effort. And to all of you who are listening, we want to continue to provide you with resources. We're going to work together on these over time. Please give us feedback. We believe knowledge is power, and we want you to have as much information as possible when you go to make these important decisions for your loved ones. But thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you next time.